This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is rock band Led Zeppelin. I am speaking with Jack Hamilton, a professor who has written many times about the group, and we will begin the discussion when we return. I'm speaking with Jack Hamilton. He is a professor who has written many pieces, or at least a few pieces, about Led Zeppelin. The one that got my attention was an article he did sometime back in Slate magazine. He is a professor who studies the media, and if you could just give a little bit of background about yourself and what drew you to Led Zeppelin in general, and anything else in regards to the topic.
Sure, yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. Yeah, I'm a professor of American Studies and Media Studies at the University of Virginia. I actually wrote my doctoral dissertation on rock music in the 1960s. But I came to be interested in Led Zeppelin, and that dissertation is coming out as a book in the fall. It actually doesn't really deal with Led Zeppelin at all. It ends kind of right before Led Zeppelin really breaks. But I've been interested in Led Zeppelin. I mean, really since I think in maybe junior high school. They were really. I'm a musician as well, and I've been playing piano since I was about 6 years old, and was a pretty good piano player. My mom is a very serious musician and enrolled me in music lessons and stuff. But I was always really interested in rock music more so than classical. And I remember the first time I really got into Led Zeppelin was probably in 7th or 8th grade. And one of the things that really I loved about them was that I had never heard rock music. And I mean, I'm younger than the average Led Zeppelin fan. I was not really alive when Led Zeppelin was making their music. There was a seriousness and a sort of instrumental virtuosity to Led Zeppelin, a sort of musical complexity and sophistication that I had never really heard rock music do. I was in that age. It was really the sort of end of kind of like 80s heavy metal and the beginnings of grunge, neither of which put quite the same premium on, I don't know how best to describe it, sort of musical complexity and sophistication that Led Zeppelin did. So I think for me, one of the things that was so important about them was that they were the first rock band I'd really ever heard that you could really tell that they were taking the music incredibly seriously. And I mean, this was obviously before I discovered a lot of other bands who did similar things. Like I wasn't really familiar with the Beatles' later material at that point. I wasn't familiar with a group like the Band at that point. But Led Zeppelin was definitely, there was something about them, just the level of sophistication and artistry that they brought to it. And also, just that it was fun and sort of infectious music.
Well, I'm glad that you said that you were a musician, because later in the show I want to ask you a little bit about song structure and what makes something stick in someone's mind beyond, say, the obvious lyrical hooks that pop music engenders. But before I get into some of the many issues with Led Zeppelin, ranging from supposed plagiarism to not giving credit to the blues to whether or not they're considered hard rock or heavy metal or whatnot, I wanted to just bring up two things, just since you studied media studies, and I'm a writer and an artist, and I spent many years in the arts, and I've observed across various arts, whether it's pop arts like rock music, or it's the higher arts like painting or novel writing or poetry. I've observed certain things, and I wanted to just toss out a couple of ideas to you just to see if any of them had any resonance to you. The first is that it seems to me in most art forms, there's a period in one's life generally when someone is most productive. For example, in most writers, I found that ages between 35 and 50 tend to be when most of the great works of a writer has written them. They've gotten past the imitative period, they hit their peak, and then they sort of fall away. But pop music, whether we go before rock or to bubblegum bands or the 1960s and 70s big foundational artists, if we say, there seems to be the 20s, the people in their 20s seem to be their most creative. They have a great album or so that they've been playing for 3 or 4 years on the road. They release one album, the second or third album is good. By the time the artist hit 30, they just repeat themselves, and then you end up with the abominations of a Mick Jagger in his 70s, strutting around as if he's, still a bubblegum pop idol. What do you agree with the idea that most rock bands like Led Zeppelin, who I would say probably their first four albums are where they rest. That's their claim to fame. Not that they didn't do some good stuff in some of the later stuff, but when you get to In Through the Outdoor, and even Presence, it doesn't
Yeah.
hold up. Do you agree with what my posit, and what do you think would explain that? Do you?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think there's a number of reasons. And there are obviously, I think, some exceptions to this. I recently wrote when last year, when BB King passed away, I wrote a obituary of BB King. And BB King is actually a musician who's sort of interesting because he was playing music from the time he was really started, I think, recording in his late teens. But I think BB King's sort of most iconic music he actually made in his 40s, which is pretty striking. But for the most part, you're absolutely right that it really is the 20s. And I think that there's a number of reasons for that. And I think it's not just rock music too. I think it's also true in R&B music, in various forms, even jazz. I think you could argue with a lot of musicians. And I think one of the big reasons is that music is really physically demanding. Music, particularly of music like rock music, where it tends to be very performance driven if you're touring a lot. That sort of takes a lot out of you, and it's a young person's sport, for lack of a better term. And so I think that there's part of it that's the physical demands of it, and the physical demands of stardom in these industries. But the other thing is, I think that when you're younger, I mean, not to sound cliche, but I think artists are sort of hungrier. Artists are more before artists have become successful. I think that they're more open to learning. They're more open to listening to what's new. It's really hard, it's as all of us learn as we get older. It's really hard keeping up on what the new thing is. It's that takes a lot of work, and a lot of us, by the time you get to your 30s, it's like you're doing other things. You don't have time to figure out what exactly is like the newest cutting edge thing. And so I think for a lot of bands, yeah, it's like that falls away too. And as soon as you lose that sort of that drive to be on the cutting edge of whatever's happening, I mean, that's popular music, whatever genre it is really a young person's game unless you're just unless you're just an absolutely brilliant person who's sort of pushing the trends.
Yeah.
As soon as it's like a lot of pop music, being a great popular musician is being responsive to things that are happening around you, just being creative, but also listening and absorbing what's happening around you. And I think that it becomes harder and harder to do that once you get older, and also once you get sort of comfortable with success. I do think that the sort of ambition that people have in their teens and their 20s, that can't really be overstated.
Yeah, that's an interesting posit you made about the physical aspect of especially rock and roll music. Because I was thinking, you know, nowadays they have these little sub channels, and there's a channel called Get TV, and they've been running the past few months reruns of the old Judy Garland show on Monday nights. And after Judy Garland, they'd have things like the Sonny and Cher hour, and then one of the nights they had a Dionne Warwick special, and Burt Bacharach was there, and they did a medley of Bacharach songs. And when I think of the 1960s, I think of Motown, the British Invasion, and Burt Bacharach. They dominated the charts, and Bacharach had something like 70 top 40 hits that he wrote or co-wrote alone. And yet he was in his 30s, just thinking about what you did. He was in his 30s when he was at his prime, but he was someone who was just writing songs. He wasn't doing much touring, and he was a band leader. So that's an interesting posit. But sticking with the idea of the British invasion, it segues into my next posit that I want to end this first segment on. I've come up with an idea that I see in the arts that I call the founder syndrome, and it's not even in the arts, but it's generally in the arts and sciences. Is that someone who acknowledges the first person in whatever endeavor, whether it's true or not, they tend to get overpraised at the belittlement of the people who are right there with them or just a step after them. When I think of in this manner, I think of someone like Pablo Picasso as a painter. I think of the Mozarts and the Beethovens. I would think of someone like William Shakespeare. And in the 20th century, certainly the Beatles and the British invasion had to do with it. And it's certainly not that the Beatles were not a good band, even when they were doing their early bubblegum stuff before they had their middle period, which I think was their best period of 66 to 67. But a lot of bands that came in the wake of the Beatles or were concurrent with them, like the Stones, like the Who, like the Hollies, like the Zombies, like the Yardbirds, Dave Clark Five, or whatnot, were in many ways just as good as there. And then I think Led Zeppelin came in sort of that second wave. They came afterwards, and I'm wondering if that was part of the critical reaction against them was part of that. So my question would be: do you think that there's such a thing as what I would call the founder syndrome? Then say a group like the Beatles benefited disproportionately from it, whereas other groups, especially someone later on like Led Zeppelin, uh, bore the brunt against that.
Yeah, I think that there definitely is. I mean, the founder syndrome thing, which I think is, yeah, I think it's a correct idea. I mean, just thinking about it in terms of, I was trained as a historian in my PhD program, and in history, like the similar, the phrase. I mean, you're probably familiar with it. People call it the great man theory of
Yeah.
history. The idea that sort of history is driven by sort of heroic individuals rather than sort of social forces and processes, which has now been pretty rejected by contemporary historiography. But I think in popular music, it still really holds. It's like popular music history. I think it's drawn to the figure of the genius, the figure of the founder, as you say. These are. I mean, it's still. I mean, part of this is that popular music is still an industry. It's a star-driven industry. It's like it's easier for people to grasp onto these major figures, and it's easy. It's more conducive to market them. So you get these sort of these things that are like who invented what. Like it's like whereas anyone who knows anything about music knows that it's very very rare that an individual invents anything. It comes out of movements and sort of interactions of various artists across usually often locations or with Led Zeppelin I think I find the critical program directed at Led Zeppelin in the early '70s, late '60s and early '70s to be one of the really interesting aspects of the band. When I was writing that story for Slate, I actually wrote that story while I was spending some time in England doing research at the British Library. So I was sort of doing that as a side project. I was looking at press coverage of Led Zeppelin from that period. And one of the things that's interesting is it's actually the idea that Led Zeppelin was sort of hated by the critics was two things about it. One was that was really basically an American reaction. The British critics actually were really, really celebratory of Led Zeppelin for the most part. There were certainly some that didn't like them. But a lot of mainstream British music criticism, like in Melody Maker or New Musical Express, loved Led Zeppelin. And another aspect was that was actually something that Led Zeppelin an image that Led Zeppelin promoted. Like Jimmy Page in interviews in the late '60s and early '70s used to go out of his way to complain about bad press coverage, which is sort of a weird thing for a musician to do. So there was a part of that I think Led Zeppelin really was partly responsible for, with this idea that critics hated them because they talked about it so much. Page in particular talked about it a lot. But I do think that there definitely was some truth to it, particularly in the States. And I think you're right that there was one of the things that a lot of the contempt at Led Zeppelin from critics seemed to be rooted in this idea that they were sort of betraying the ideals of rock music as a generation of critics had sort of defined them in the mid to late 1960s. So this idea of sort of rock and roll being a kind of rock and rock and roll being a sort of utopian force, a force for changing the world for the better, all the kind of political entanglements of the late '60s that were sort of kind of tie. I always think that's a little bit overstated how much sort of late '60s rock music really had to do with the politics of the period. I mean, in some cases it had a lot to do with it, but I mean, on blanket terms, it's a little less clear. But Led Zeppelin were definitely a band that were generally speaking not particularly politically engaged, and they also were just like they were huge. They made a ton of money. They weren't particularly subtle in a lot of the ways that I think critics at the time wanted subtlety. But yeah, they definitely caught, I think, some blowback for just the sort of the disillusionment of a critical generation that I think were kind of angry about the way that the '60s had ended. I mean, in a lot of ways, I think of a lot of the stuff that's directed, the hostility directed at Zeppelin in '70 and '71 really actually kind of feels like misplaced hostility that should have been directed at the Rolling Stones. And I think that there was a sort of sense that people were really mad at the Stones, after Altamont and stuff.
Yeah.
And I think Zeppelin caught a lot of that heat. Like it was in a way that wasn't really fair, but they were sort of seen as the Zeppelin. I think of it like an interesting way to think of them is that they're a definitively post Rolling Stones rock band, and they're maybe the first big. Even though I don't think they have that much to do with them, that was how they were filtered by the people that received them.
Okay, well, let's end this first segment here. In our next segment, I want to pick up a little bit of threads about the coming together of the band, and I don't want to do sort of a song-by-song analysis. I want to sort of talk about some of the larger trends and things, and we'll do that when we return. As I mentioned, I don't want to really do one of these sort of celebrity-based, about who the boys were and where they came from and their personal lives. I mean, Led Zeppelin was one of those bands that was famously celebrated for the rock and roll lifestyle. And just for those who don't know, it was comprised of Jimmy Page, who came from the Yardbirds and was considered one of the virtuoso rock gods of the '60s, along with Jeff Beck, Jimi Hendrix, and Eric Clapton. Robert Plant was a young blues singer. I think he was the youngest of the quartet. John Bonham and John Paul Jones were both well-regarded studio musicians, I believe, weren't they?
Yeah, John Paul Jones in particular was a top notch. Jones and Page were both superstar studio musicians. Bonham and Plant were a little bit less experienced, but still really well known. Particularly Bonham. Bonham was a really highly regarded drummer.
Well, when the first Led Zeppelin album came out, it was one of those things that, in a sense, like you said, I think was defining, because there had certainly been what you could call hard rock before them. Cream certainly would probably be the band that is the antecedent, that the electric blues kind of thing. And then you had Deep Purple maybe around the same time, switching from psychedelic to their classic sound of the early '70s. And then a year or two later came Black Sabbath. But I wanted to know, and we'll talk a little bit about the hard rock, heavy metal definitional thing, but I think one of the reasons, and I'll posit this to you, was Led Zeppelin the first band that came of age as an album-oriented rock band? Certainly, if you look at the first wave of the British invasion, it was all singles, and then it sort of evolved to album. Was part of the critical reaction that very few of Led Zeppelin's songs were top 40 ready-made?
That's a great point. Yeah, I think probably some of it was what had to do with that. I mean, they did have some hits, actually. I mean, I was shocked to learn, or not shocked, but Whole Lot of Love was actually, I think that's their biggest hit, and it actually, I think it cracked it. If it didn't crack the top 10 in the States, it cracked the top 20. I think it maybe peaked at number 12 or something like that, which is pretty high. I think you're right that it's like, I mean, thinking about it, I mean, there's other artists that one could sort of make that claim about the first album oriented, but I think Zeppelin, I think that's really true, that it's really, that rock starts really becoming kind of fundamentally album oriented in the wake of Sgt. Pepper in '67, and I think, Zeppelin, the first Zeppelin album comes out in January of '69. And there's not really, there's some great tracks on that album, but there's not a clear single. And furthermore, it doesn't feel like an album that's remotely concerned with having a clear single, and
Yeah.
that I think is a pretty big yeah, it's a pretty significant thing. I mean to be fair as well. I mean, one of the things that I think that the critics were kind of right about with Led Zeppelin was that Led Zeppelin. Personally, and this is getting a little subjective, but it's like I don't think that songwriting was the strongest suit of Led Zeppelin. I mean, Led Zeppelin had this incredible power and an incredible virtuosity, and they were able to make these incredibly great recordings and incredibly great sort of recorded performances, but they did not have the songwriting chops, or even I wouldn't even say chops. Like, I don't think that it was something that they prioritized to the degree that a Lennon and McCartney had prioritized that, or even a Jagger Richards had prioritized that. Like, felt like something that Led Zeppelin was interested in sort of a different set of concerns, and I think that was something that rubbed critics the wrong way as well. Was this sort of sense that this is like the lyrics weren't great, the song structures were often a little bit lacking in terms of sort of originality and things like that.
Well, since you bring it up, let's just talk it because as I'm looking at the track list on the first album, I think perhaps the only possibly totally original songs would have been "Good Times, Bad Times," and "Communication Breakdown." All the
Yeah.
rest of them seem to have been obvious reworks of blues records. Was that an early criticism that they had basically, or not they, but basically Page? Page was probably 90% responsible for the stealing because, as you said, he was this superstar in the studio, and he had played on many blues and rock albums, uncredited and credited sometimes. So he was drenched in all of this. Was that part of the early critical backlash, or was that something that over the years sort of mounted up?
Yeah, that was there from the beginning. That was that part of the backlash. I mean, sort of the most notorious negative Led Zeppelin review was Rolling Stone magazine's review of Led Zeppelin 2, which just it's one of the most savage record reviews I've ever read, and it's savage along those lines. It's really they're coming after them for stealing the blues essentially, and kind of exploiting the blues and doing it in a heavy-handed way. So yeah, I think that was definitely there from the beginning. I mean, it's interesting that I mean, to my ears at least, Communication Breakdown and Good Times, Bad Times are far and away the best tracks on the first Led Zeppelin album. So that's sort of interesting. Maybe they should have been writing more stuff. But I mean, to be fair as well, like, I mean, especially with early Led Zeppelin, there was a lot of sort of like gray area plagiarism, borrowing slash theft or whatever. But it wasn't just the blues. I mean, Dazed and Confused, like the lyrics to that are more or less lifted from a folk song.
Yeah.
And so they were sort of, I don't know if it's in their defense, but they were sort of stealing from everything.
Yeah. Wasn't there a rock band that they toured with that the opening of one of the? I think it was the opening of Stairway to Heaven that was
Yeah,
playing.
that's something
But
that's come up more recently. This band, I can't remember the name of the band,
yeah.
but it's claiming that the Page plagiarized their.
But the odd thing that I find is when I listen to the original that they supposedly stole from, it doesn't sound anything like the opening to Stairway to Heaven. So it's ironic that Led Zeppelin got away with stealing definitively from earlier bands and didn't pay much of a price, and yet now they're being sued for a song that probably seems frivolous in my mind.
Totally. No, I had the same response when I heard that. It doesn't seem like that case really has much to stand on. And like this is something I actually was just earlier this week with a colleague of mine teaches a class in sort of media copyright, and I was in his class sort of guest lecturing with him about these issues around music and how tricky it is. And one of the sort of landmark cases in this was Willie Dixon's estate suing Led Zeppelin for Whole Lotta Love and winning, which was a very clear plagiarism case because they plagiarized lyrics. Plagiarizing things like melody and chord changes and things like that, which are much more of what the Stairway to Heaven case is about, are much harder to prove, and also harder to prove and also just harder to win. And I'm with you that I don't hear enough of a similarity. It seems like a frivolous lawsuit to me.
You know, the first and second albums, in a sense, are almost like the first. They're almost like one album because they're very similar structurally. The first album that I ever got when I was like 10 or 11 years old was the third album, which was caused a critical backlash for a totally different reason. Was because it was thought that Led Zeppelin was going acoustic, going soft, and whatnot. And that again was another album that's rife with plunderings here and there. And probably the most original song is probably the best known song from there, the Immigrant Song. And that also led them into this sort of J.R.R. Tolkien kind of thing. I mean, it talks about the Vikings and the storming, like, you know, the Norman conquest of 1066 or whatnot. And so talk a little bit, if you could, just about that album, because that one, from everything I've ever read, was critically savage too, but for totally different reasons than the first two.
Yeah, it's interesting. That one was, I think, no one knew what to do with that album. I find that album really fascinating. It may ultimately, I mean, that's sort of like, I feel like Led Zeppelin 3 is sort of the contrarian pick for favorite Led Zeppelin album, but I actually think it might be my favorite Led Zeppelin album. I go back and forth between 3 and 4, which is,
Yeah.
you know, 4 is sort of the classic, but 4 is such a great album. But 3 is so interesting, and it's really, it's one of the reasons it's interesting is that I think that, and I think I've actually read this confirmed, that one of the reasons they made that album was as a response to their critics. Like, that this was sort of like they wanted to show that they could do other things than Whole Lotta Love and stuff like that. Which again is just really interesting. Like the notion of a rock band being that invested in reading their own reviews is just like, it's just weird. It's hard to think of another band that was really like that. But yeah, I think Free is a really interesting record. There's a lot of really beautiful songs on that, and it is a really, I think it was misunderstood at the time. Just jumping out, jumping to mind, the New York Times wrote a really, 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 again, really savage review of that record when it came out. Just trashed it. It's one of those reviews where it feels like the person didn't even listen to it. It's just really, really, really nasty. And then it's funny, in Rolling Stone magazine, which had previously had trashed Led Zeppelin, Lester Bangs, the great music critic, actually reviewed Led Zeppelin 3 and gave it a pretty positive review, but even that review is just like, it's really backhanded. Like Bangs still basically goes out of his way to kind of call them idiots, and it sort of suggests that they lucked into this album that sort of like, when it succeeds, it's almost like in spite of itself. But yeah, I think that album is really interesting. There's a lot of sort of folk music influences. A huge influence on that album is Joni Mitchell, who they had gotten into pretty seriously by that point. And that's really right around the time that Joni Mitchell was hitting one of her real creative high water marks. So that's interesting too. It's like, that's something I think that doesn't get talked about enough with Led Zeppelin. It's just how much different music that they were into, and how they were really open to a lot of influences. Like, it wasn't just the plagiarism.
Yeah,
but yeah.
The fourth album has "Going to California," which seems like a very Mitchell-esque kind of lyric there, and then the next two albums also had some of that softer, more contemplative music. But you'd mentioned song structure, and the fourth album is without a doubt considered their best album. It's got probably the #1 AOR song of all time, "Stairway to Heaven." And, it had the controversy. Is it called Runes? Is it called Four? Is it called Zoso? Is it called Zofo? Whatever. But let's talk a little bit about song structure there, because, I mean, when you look at it, it has 8 songs, and, most of them, like Black Dog, Rock and Roll, Misty Mountain Hops, 4-6, Stairway to Heaven, there's at least 5 that probably at any 24-hour period, any hard rock station is going to play at least one of those songs several times. When the Levee Breaks is another classic blues song reworked. Going to California, I said, is sort of their soft song. And then the Battle of Evermore is getting back into that kind of Tolkien-esque thing. So talk a little bit about hooks or the song structure, because those songs, even more so than the songs in the first 2 albums, seem to be where people go back to when they think Led Zeppelin. Was there something particular that Page and Plant were going for can you discern a pattern of that makes this such a definitive album for them?
Yeah, I mean, I think think in a lot of ways it's their most sort of versatile album. I think one thing with Led Zeppelin 3 was that like they may have, and again like an album that I really love, but I think that they maybe overcompensated with Led Zeppelin 3 and sort of went too far in the acoustic direction for I mean Led Zeppelin 3 was sort of at the time that it came out their least successful album commercially, from a commercial standpoint. And then four though was really four is the album where it really feels like it kind of all comes together. That as you mentioned, it has a real diverse array of things that they're doing. But yeah, I think that in terms of the songwriting and the structure and stuff, it's pretty ambitious. It's well crafted. It feels like they're paying again, like as I said previously on the first couple of albums, where they almost seem sort of unconcerned with that. They seem a little bit more concerned with it on four. I think a song like Black Dog, which is in a lot of ways a very conventional Led Zeppelin song, or at least at this point extremely iconic Led Zeppelin song. There's actually a lot of interesting things going on in that song. The guitar hooks. That's a song with a lot of hooks, which aren't things that Led Zeppelin didn't seem that interested in hooks previously. Similar to Misty Mountain Hop, has that great sort of riff. And Stairway is just like, Stairway is a pretty incredible piece of music. I mean, it's at this point, I think it's obviously become a bit of a cliche, or more than a bit of a cliche. But there is something to that song where they really nailed something, and I think they achieved something on that song that there's nothing else like that in the entire kind of canon of rock music. I mean, there's a lot of attempts at it, but no one else nails what that song did. And I don't know that anyone else should nail it. I think it's sort of a one-of-a-kind thing, but there was definitely something. And what's interesting about Stairway too is that was another one that they set out. Page was really he was like, I'm going to make a masterpiece. Like, I'm going to make a song that's critic proof, essentially. Like, I'm going to prove that I can write, this sort of like the greatest rock song, which I don't think he did, but I think he did something, almost more interesting. He created this really unique and weird piece of music. I mean, interestingly for me, the best track on Led Zeppelin 4 is When the Levee Breaks, because I think that When the Levee Breaks, even though it's a reworking of Memphis Minnie's song from the 1920s, and it doesn't. I mean, that's a song that barely has chord changes. It's basically just on E the entire song. But there's something about that song that is, to me, it's the quintessential Led Zeppelin song. It's the song that like every time the production is so phenomenal, the performances are so phenomenal, and it's one of those songs where there's just no other band in history that could make a song like that. It's the one that to me there's just such a sort of magic and kind of I don't know. There's a sort of essential mystique to that song that really bottles what Led Zeppelin did best. But Stairway, I think, too, is an incredible song.
Well, this was sort of the era of these long, bombastic songs. Before Led Zeppelin, you had several 10-plus minute songs from The Doors, like The End, and most famously. A few years later, you had the Bohemian Rhapsody by Queen, which did a lot of going through different stages in the song. Freebird is probably the longest song in Southern rock that is probably the closest equivalent in terms of airplay by Lynyrd Skynyrd. Let me just ask then a little bit about hooks too, since we're talking song structure. We're talking about the guitar hooks, and probably Led Zeppelin has more guitar hooks, more things that you say, Led Zeppelin, when you just, whether it's the beginning of the song or it's in the middle of the song, probably the only guitarist that maybe even comes within spitting distance of Page is maybe Ritchie Blackmore of Deep Purple, I think.
I would think Keith Richards too.
Yeah. So talk a little bit about the influence of Page, because Page basically was the guy. I mean, most of the lyrics people concede were done by Plant. He was into a lot of that Tolkien-esque kind of thing. But Page seems to have been the guy who was always structuring the songs. Did he go for bombast? Did he say, well, here is where I need to have the hook? Because if you're writing a short story or if you're making a film, you always think, someone like a great filmmaker like an Antonioni or a Kurosawa is always going to be thinking about, I need to have that little scene that is sort of the key. And sometimes it may be what Hitchcock calls a MacGuffin, but most great rock songs too have that moment. It's either a guitar lick, it might be a song lyric. What did Page sort of was he consciously planting into his songs that was going to say, this is going to get them back and play it over and over again?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think you identified it with the. I mean, I think the riffs thing certainly, like it's like Page was a great kind of riff driven guitarist who's great at writing riffs. And I mean, to me, what's amazing about Page is, I mean, obviously the guitar playing. I mean, one of the things that obviously he's a phenomenal guitar player. One of the most underrated aspects of Page is that I think he's the best acoustic guitar player that ever played rock music. Like I think his acoustic work is incredible. He's such a subtle and sort of delicate acoustic player. Like I actually find a lot of his acoustic playing even more compelling than his electric playing. But the other thing that I think is really is Page's enormous contribution is that he was such an incredible producer, and I think one of the things that Led Zeppelin did was that one of the ways they actually kind of got around not always having the greatest lyrics, or not even necessarily having all that many great hooks. I mean, sometimes they did. With obviously there are exceptions, but it's like the way that he used the sort of studio space to create these sounds and these total experiences musically. Like it's like, I mean, just a track like Ramble On or What Is and What Should Never Be on Led Zeppelin 2. Like these are Ramble On is one that's like, I mean, those lyrics are all Tolkien stuff. It's like Ramble On is not like, I mean, it's kind of a interesting lyrical text, but it's not. It's like good luck making sense of it. But it's like there's something about listening to those tracks and like it's like that it's really turning the studio into a band member basically. Like it's using that, like it's taking. He just did so much with audible space. I mean, the only other rock musician I can think of that expanded the possibilities of the studio to that degree was Hendrix. Like I think Hendrix also, an album like Electric Ladyland, the studio functions in the same way. But yeah, I think that was really the way that Page used engineering and studio and production and just like the shaping of the actual sort of aesthetic sounds of the instruments, and almost made that an element of the songwriting, is really striking in Led Zeppelin's music.
The next two albums I sort of lumped together, Houses of the Holy and Physical Graffiti, and this is sort of like they're taking aim at every possible pop music format in these two albums. I mean, the range of the songs, whether they work or not. I mean, you have No Quarter reminds me of, it sounds like whale songs almost. You have the ocean on House of the Holy is probably the most radio friendly of those songs. On Physical Graffiti, you have songs from the first 4 or 5 years that some of them didn't make it to other albums, including Houses of the Holy, the song which didn't make it onto the titular album. But you have, hard rock songs like The Rover. You have old blues songs like In My Time of Dying. And then you have just like side 4 of that double album. You have, a bunch of songs, Night Flight, Wanton Song, Boogie with Stu, Black Country Woman, Sick Again, that seem to just come out of nowhere from their past. This I would consider their middle period, where they're at the top of their game. Led Zeppelin in the mid '70s is the singular biggest rock band of all time. By that time, I mean they are what was parodied in Rob Reiner's film Spinal Tap. So talk about sort of those two albums. Where was the band directionally going? What were there? I mean, the band did end with the death of Bonham, but were there any inner tensions? Where were they at making this wide array of songwriting?
Yeah, I mean, I think that those are interesting albums because it is sort of, I think it's a sort of transitional phase for them. As you mentioned, by that point they're completely huge, and I think that's sort of the moment that even though those albums I think are both really good to great. I don't place those albums quite at the level of the 4 that came before them. I mean, I think that would be the best album Led Zeppelin ever made, but I think that it's a little too sprawling, and there's just sort of like it starts to get a little unfocused. And Houses of the Holy is great too, but there's also some stuff on it that feels like a little bit of a misstep. But yeah, I mean, I do think that they were starting to, success, that level of success does weird things to rock bands, and it's like, I mean, I think it's pretty well documented that they started sort of drifting apart from each other at that point. There was Robert Plant's family was in a car accident. I think
Yeah.
that was around in between those.
Yeah, I think one of his children died.
Yeah, it was something really tragic. And I mean, the other thing that's like, I mean, just has to be acknowledged is that like I think that's around the time that the sort of substance abuse started getting really pretty bad, and it's like, and I think particularly for Page, who really was, I mean, Page was the creative driving force behind that band. Even though I actually would say that I think that John Paul Jones is sort of the most underrated figure in Led Zeppelin in terms of what the versatility of things that he brought to the table, and also a guy who actually never, by all accounts, never got into drugs. But yeah, I mean, I think by the mid '70s, like the sort of the decadence aspect, like it's like the sort of the sex and drugs aspect. It starts getting, all the stuff that starts, kind of getting, that turns Led Zeppelin into kind of the limit case of hedonism in rock music has started to really I think, kind of infect the creative process. And I think that was really something, and I think that created a lot of tensions. It's like that there was sort of the level of, sort of alcoholism with Bonham, heroin use with certain members. I mean, these are things that are really, started to become really destructive, and I think it became harder for them to work. And I think those albums start to reflect that. And I definitely think the albums after that, as you mentioned, like Presence and Into the Outdoor are really, particularly Presence, it just sort of feels like a kind of haze of an album that doesn't really come together.
Yeah, I was gonna get into. I mean, probably Achilles' Last Stand is probably the best song on that one. It's one of these long, epic kind of songs. And then Into the Out. I remember when I was a kid and we were waiting for that last album, and it's sort of almost, I think, a parody of earlier Led Zeppelin stuff. I mean, it's only really 10 years their heyday. But that album just seemed to be so tired. I mean, songs like All My Love they could have been written by Diane Warren, the lyrics. I mean, it was just very limp and Fool in the Rain, and it's like, you just wonder why they would put that out. I mean, and then you look at an album that it's considered their last studio album, but it's really just a compilation of throwaways, Coda. If you look at that, it couldn't be more obvious, because probably the best, hardest rocking songs on there are the earliest songs, such as like We're Gonna Groove and Poor Tom. And then you see, there are a few variations there. And then Bonham dies. And let's talk a little bit then about Bonham's death and what, because they're one of the few bands that really didn't milk it. Yeah, they had a handful of performances when they were inducted into the Rock Hall of Fame, and I think Bonham's son Jason might have done a few dates, but they really haven't done, as far as I know, any big tours to really milk the stuff. Whereas other bands, like now you have Townsend and Daltrey, who are going the Mick Jagger route. There's only two of them left. I mean, it's like if you had Paul and Ringo trying to do a Beatles. I mean, it just seems ridiculous. Talk a little bit about, the post-Zeppelin careers of these men.
Yeah, well, I think that's like one of the most interesting aspects of sort of like these, like the sort of afterlife of Led Zeppelin. And yeah, Bonham. I think Bonham died in 1980, or maybe it was even 79. But it's like, I mean, one of the things about Bonham's death was that if you read about the band in that period, it's like the writing was already really on the wall that they were ending. Like it was like that was sort of, I think Bonham's death was sort of the catalyst for just like officially calling it quits. But it was clear, I think, that they were sort of out of gas. But yeah, it's been interesting. I think it's really to their credit that they resisted the sort of big reunion tour. I think in a lot of ways, I think I wrote about this at the end of the Slate piece. Like, it's like one of the things that's so fascinating about their post Zeppelin careers is like I feel like all three of those guys have really spent a lot of their post Zeppelin careers almost sort of trying to run from Led Zeppelin. Like, it's like this sort of that they've all gone and done really interesting things, particularly Plant, who's like, you know, in the last like 10 years or so has had this really interesting rebirth as this kind of, you know, Americana, um, you know, making this really like really tasteful music. Like really, it's this really kind of like he's emerged into this very kind of elegant post. Like you know, he's like almost a model of how to be like a middle aged slash almost post middle age, you know, rock musician. Like in the stuff he's been doing with like, you know, T-Bone Burnett and you know, various people, and the Alison Krauss album, which obviously won him a Grammy. Interestingly, Led Zeppelin never won a Grammy. And Page too, you know, has kept busy doing a bunch of different things. And John Paul Jones has kept busy as well, certainly. And all these guys have like I think aged fairly gracefully in a way that no one would have thought they would have in like 1975 or 1980 or something. Like they've actually really kind of grown up. And I do think that this sort of I think avoiding the sort of opportunistic cash in thing is good. You know, it's like in the same way that like you know people always talk about you know the cliche about the Beatles, like you know the best thing the Beatles ever did for their career was breaking up in 1970,
Yeah.
and then you know never getting back together. Like it's like you know so that all we have to remember that band by is 63 to 70. You know, we don't have like the sort of middle-aged Beatles trying to, you know, doing what the Stones have been doing for the last, you know, however long. And same with Zeppelin, like that. It's like you know, Led Zeppelin. You know, Page and Plant did that reunion in the mid '90s with the sort of MTV Unplugged thing. But even that was like kind of interesting because it found them really reworking their songs and really doing new things and not just cashing in on nostalgia. It felt like it was something. It felt like it was actually a creative project. As opposed to what the Stones have been doing, which is just sort of like their greatest hits tour. And Zeppelin's not done that, and I think that's really interesting and to their credit.
Well, let's talk about the four individual members. Let's start with Bonham since he died, and he's generally considered probably one of the two or three greatest rock and roll drummers. You're a musician, and I'm not. Can you talk a little bit technically what you think might have been his best work and why he is considered that, along with, I guess Keith Moon is probably posited right up there with Bonham. Tell me a little bit of what made Bonham a great drummer.
Yeah, I mean, I think that his real, a lot of things. I mean, like, I think that one of the things was just power. Like, Bonham, you know, it's like, as you can tell from just listening, even if you're not a musician, it's like John Bonham probably hit the drums harder than anyone has ever hit them. You know, it's like, and again, some of this was Page, you know, that if Page knew how to record drums. I mean, the famous example is the drums on When the Levee Breaks, which sound absolutely enormous. And the way that they got that sound was by putting his drum kit at the bottom of a flight of stairs and putting a microphone at the top of the flight of stairs, so you have this cavernous echo, which is why that kick drum sounds like that. But there's like, I'm not a drummer, but like it's like, you know, things that drummers geek out about is, you know, the drum part on Good Times Bad Times, where he does this incredibly intricate double kick drum pattern. It's just like technically incredible. Like it's you know, it's one of these things that it's just like you know, it seems like it should be impossible. I've seen it demonstrated by people, and it's just insane. And like the fact that he did that on their first song, like this was like, you know, this was the first song on their first album, and he's laying down this drum part that sounded like something no one had ever played before. Is pretty amazing. But I mean, I think a lot of it really is the power and just that he played really, you know, had such an aggression and such a it was just such a presence. I mean, I think actually to something of a detriment. Like it's like I think that particularly on live recordings, you can hear the drums sometimes are just so overpowering, and so like I think Bonham was so wrapped up in his own playing, sometimes live, that he wasn't really listening to what else was happening around. Like, and
Mm.
it might have just been that he couldn't hear it because he was playing so loud. But you definitely hear there's some Zeppelin live recordings where the drums just get completely just sort of go off in their own thing, and it sort of sounds like the band is kind of falling apart. But yeah, I mean, he definitely, when he was at the top of his game, like, I mean, there was no one like him.
Now, John Paul Jones is considered, usually along with John Entwistle of The Who, as probably two of the best bassists there. And if you can isolate some of their riffs, they're almost both of Entwistle and Jones have these movements. I don't know what you call it, power chords or whatnot, that are almost as signature to their songs as the lead guitarists are. What do you think set John Paul Jones apart from a lot of other bands that had bassists who basically were just guys who were sort of like the fourth wheel?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, Jones is so interesting because I mean he was a phenomenal bass player, but he played a lot of other instruments too. So anytime you hear organ on Zeppelin tracks, it's John Paul Jones, and he's a really good organ player. And I say that as I'm an organ player as well. And it's like, I mean, John Paul Jones could have been a professional organ player if he wanted to be. Um, so he was really versatile. But in terms of the bass playing, I mean, the person who you have to talk about when talking about John Paul Jones, and it was his biggest musical influence was the legendary Motown session bass player James Jamerson, who really Jamerson in the '60s really redefined the electric bass by turning it into basically a melody instrument as opposed to a rhythmic instrument. Jamerson came from a jazz background and played these incredibly intricate, technically, incredible lines that were just these these little, these sort of miniature symphonies that were conducted on the bass. Like it's like particularly later '60s Motown stuff. The bass playing on that is just incredible. And when you hear, like one of John Paul Jones's most famous bass lines is the bass line of Ramble On, which is just it's all Jamerson. It's just that's clear that it's just that is who his influence is on that track. Another interesting thing about Jones as a bass player that sets him apart from a lot of British guys, including Entwistle and including Paul McCartney too, is that Jones played with his fingers. He didn't play with a pick, which is something that is that for Entwistle and McCartney, who were converted guitar players, they were playing with a pick. And Jones was playing with his fingers, which is the more kind of classical way to play bass. And not to say that that's better or something, but it lends a different sound. Both texturally, the sound of fingers against strings is warmer than pick against strings, but it also gives a sort of dexterity to his performances. And Jamerson played with his fingers as well.
Let's talk about Plant. In the 60s, male lead vocals, especially in rock and pop, were divided into sort of the higher voices, the more, I guess you would call tenor voices, were doing bubblegum pop. And then you'd have people like a Jim Morrison that had the more manly voices. Roger Daltrey had a deeper, richer voice. And he would do some screaming or whatnot. But along comes Plant. And Plant is the guy who makes the falsetto, sort of the signature that for 25, 30 years, every rock singer, whether they were famous like David Lee Roth had a little bit deeper voice, but I mean, Plant becomes sort of the prototype for the rock singer god, the guy who poses on stage. Not that there wasn't precedence with someone like Morrison, but when one thinks of a rock band singer, especially a hard rock or heavy metal singer, one inevitably thinks of Plant. Where did he come from, and how much of this was his deliberate posing and deliberately done for effect?
Yeah, Plant is interesting, because he does. It's a style that, to a certain degree, comes out of nowhere. And there hadn't really been that much precedent for it. Something that people have, an influence that people have cited that I think is true, and it's a little bit unusual because of the cross gender thing, but it's Janis Joplin is actually someone who I think Plant sings at times a lot like, and certainly someone who was extremely influential, and who passed away right around the time Led Zeppelin started becoming huge. Plant, I think, like in interviews I've read with him, he always talks about his main vocal influence as being Ray Charles,
Mm.
which obviously was huge for a ton of these British singers. Joe Cocker obviously is, I think, his entire aesthetic is really devoted is sort of indebted to Ray Charles. But Plant, I don't hear the Ray Charles sing as much with Plant just because Ray Charles didn't sing like Robert Plant.
Yeah.
But I'll take Plant's word for it that was his influence. I mean, I think again, as you mentioned earlier, Plant was really young, and so I think that there was an element of like that, just sort of like I think he's 19 on their first record. And
Yeah, I think he was 4 or 5 years younger than the rest of them.
Yeah. And so I think that part of it was just that he was just doing his thing. Yeah, I don't know entirely where it comes from, and I've never really heard a totally suitable explanation. Whereas with a lot of other singers, it's like Rod Stewart talks about his big influence being Sam Cooke, which you can hear completely in Rod Stewart. But with Plant, I don't know. He's a pretty unique singer.
Well, if Plant was influential in regards to singing, certainly Jimmy Page was just as influential, if not more influential, in terms of guitar players. And we've mentioned some other guitarists. We've mentioned Blackmore and Hendrix, and I had mentioned earlier Beck and Clapton, who were in the Yardbirds at different times along with Page. I know Page started out as a skiffle player, which was a 1950s sort of folk British movement, and there are, I think, 2 or 3 clips on YouTube and elsewhere of Page on some talent show when he's 13 or 14. You said that he had spent many years then in the studio as a studio musician. This acculturated him, seeped him in pop music of all sorts. Talk about where you would place him in the pantheon of the Claptons and the Becks and the Hendrix and all the rest that came afterwards. What particularly about his playing style made him uniquely Jimmy Page? And since he was so famously now roasted for stealing, a lot of the song lyrics, was he that great a player, or did his technical virtuosity overcome his penchant for thievery?
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely. He's an incredible guitar player. And it's hard to say, it's like ranking of guitar players is so subjective, and everyone's all those guys you mentioned. It's like they have their things that they do incredibly well. I personally, I think that. Page was. I think one of the. Again, going back to I think that the way that he got guitars to sound is a huge contribution. I think his acoustic playing is really underrated, and not just his acoustic playing, his recording of acoustic guitars. The way acoustic guitars sound on Led Zeppelin records, they sound gorgeous. They sort of they sparkle, and they and similar with the electric guitar, he just got sort of sounds and textures out of it in the recording studio. He's obviously a virtuosic player. I do think that if I had to pick an element of Jimmy Page's playing that I think is maybe a bit overrated, would be his as a soloist. That I think he's obviously a virtuosic soloist, but I think that his best solos to me, Page's best solos to me are the ones that are really short and really concise, where he's forced to kind of the guitar solo on the Rover, which is 8 bars long, is one of my favorite Page solos. The guitar solo on Stairway to Heaven, which is 16 bars long, is fantastic. At the very end, when it's stuff like Dazed and Confused, and particularly a lot of the Led Zeppelin stuff where he's just playing and playing and playing. That some people get really into that. That's not so much what I'm into. There's other soloists that I think are I think Hendrix, in terms of someone who was a sort of sprawling soloist, was a more interesting soloist. Probably Clapton at the height of his powers was a probably a better soloist. A guitarist I always think of, and I'm not a huge fan of his band, but who I just think is a genius, is Duane Allman from this period. Who I just think it's Duane Allman's ideas as a guitar player. I think he's really if you had to find someone who's sort of the closest thing to what Coltrane was to the saxophone, just in terms of a purely original kind of just had this sort of spiritual connection to sort of musical ideas on its instrument. But I mean, Page is, I mean, it's. I mean, this is like at a certain point, it's just like splitting hairs. I mean, Page is incredible.
Well, let's
And yeah, I mean, it's like it's everything. His reputation is totally deserved. I don't think that there's any real element of Page that I think is criminally overrated or anything like
well,
that.
let's talk a little bit since we've talked about his so-called plagiarism. When you listen to the originals, the blues originals, they're interesting, and I've always enjoyed the blues, but there's something about the way that hard rock took the blues, not only Led Zeppelin but other bands too, that makes it more contemporary, makes it more that young men especially can, each guitar riff is sort of the blood boiling in there. You see a hot chick walk by and and swing with the guitar. Talk about Page as an arranger, because it seems to me that Page took a lot of these songs, and there's a more sexual, there's a more animalistic, angry, rebellious streak to it, that you can listen to some of these blues songs and they're interesting, but a lot of them you sort of feel they need a little bit more. That and Page seemed to intuitively know, even though he didn't give credit to the originals, he knew how to make them the best that they could be. Talk a bit about him as a rock and roll arranger.
Yeah, in terms of the arranger, yeah, I mean, like he definitely. I mean, Page. I think one of the things about Led Zeppelin is that they heard dimensions to the blues that other people hadn't heard before. I mean, I think that's sort of like that's pretty indisputable. That they took the blues in directions that it had not gone before. And, like it's like you can argue that whether or not that was always a good thing. Like I do think that there's elements. Like it's like I mean. I love blues music, and like one of the things that I love about classic blues is the exact stuff that Zeppelin was into was that it's a music that really works on sort of nuance and subtlety and irony, and it's a really it's such a I don't know, there's such artistry to it and such understatement in a lot of it. And sometimes it's like with Zeppelin, it was like they got rid of the understatement and just made it completely, on a song like the Lemon Song or something, where it's like, you don't need to make the sexual allusions in that song quite so over the top, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But yeah, at the same time, it definitely was something where they would take, I mean, something like In My Time of Dying, which you mentioned earlier, just the thought to turn that into a sort of 12-minute epic song, that takes a certain level of imagination and the sort of like the way that they were able to take this music and like really blow it up into something that was, and part of that was that like obviously when that music was originally being made, that those capabilities weren't there. It's like I mean a lot of the records that Zeppelin were taking from, were borrowing from, were originally released on 78 RPMs, which had 78s contained 2.5-3 minutes of music tops. So it's like even and one of the things that's interesting about the history of the blues is that like a lot of these songs like that like Charlie Patton's music or something which was recording in the late 1920s. When Charlie Patton was recording songs, he had to really go out of his way to make them that length. And there's stories about Charlie Patton performing live where he would play the same song for an hour in one sitting, and it's just like it's closer to what Led Zeppelin maybe were doing, this sort of. So yeah, but like definitely their arrangements, I think the way that they used, yeah, I mean that just like they took. I think you could say they kind of modernized some of this stuff. Again, for better and worse, I think like some of it was like why reinvent the wheel? Yeah. But then sometimes it worked really well.
Well, let's bring before I give you closing remarks and end the interview. I just wanted to ask you one pointed question. The hard rock / heavy metal debate. A lot of people define. For me, when I was growing up in the '70s. I always thought of Zeppelin was a hard rock band, whereas when I thought of heavy metal, I thought of Deep Purple and Black Sabbath, because they would have those thudding sort of synthesizer kind of music. Is there any general agreement on what defines hard rock differently from heavy metal, or is it just sort of a personal opinion?
Yeah, I don't think that there's really, I don't think there's a real consensus. No, yeah, I think that it's really, things like genre is such a slippery thing in general, but like particularly in popular music, and particularly with a band like Zeppelin, where it's like they really come along at a turning point. And so you can kind of, yeah, it's like, I definitely think I'm with you where I think of them more as hard rock than heavy metal.
Mm.
Yeah, and I think of heavy metal as really like something. I think of the heyday of heavy metal as really being more of a later '70s into the '80s kind of thing.
Mm.
I mean that might be wrong, or other people would, I'm sure, disagree with that. But that sort of just speaks to the way it's kind of arbitrary. I think the way that these things get categorized. But yeah, I don't really see Zeppelin as like one of the things about heavy metal that I think of. There's a great book about heavy metal written by a musicologist named Rob Walter, and the title of the book is "Running with the Devil."
Yeah.
And it's sort of like and it's great, like, because he does a lot with sort of like heavy metal ideology and sort of like the way heavy metal and heavy metal fans kind of conceive of the music. It's really interested in stuff like, it's more interested in kind of like the occult and sort of danger and evil. It's like all the sort of cliches about kind of like the dark, the stuff that we actually do associate more with Black Sabbath
Yeah.
stuff. And it's like Black Sabbath wasn't really a band that wrote a lot of songs that were like love songs. Whereas Zeppelin really did, like a lot of Led Zeppelin songs, or at least their sex songs. Like it's like they're Led Zeppelin in terms of the content of their music. I mean, with the exceptions of the stuff where they start getting into Tolkien and sort of more Aleister Crowley stuff, but even that is like stuff that I think was more influential on heavy metal than it was like actually heavy metal.
Okay.
So I think that's how I would put it. That they were influential on the genre without being, I think, really part of it.
Well, as a closing remark, then, if you had to take a couple of minutes to sum up for someone just coming to Led Zeppelin why their music endures and why they should still be plumbed, just give a 1 or 2 minute wrap up if you could.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think that Led Zeppelin really. I mean, this is sort of an article I made in the Slate piece that I wrote, but I think that it's really to understand the way rock music has evolved, both musically and really kind of critically and philosophically over the last 45 years. You really have to understand Led Zeppelin, that it's like, I think that they in a lot of ways are even more central to the sort of debates that we have about rock music and have been having since then than even a band like the Beatles or the Stones. Like it's like, I think that the Zeppelin, as being a band that was like, first of all, were always huge. Like Led Zeppelin they started as a super group. They were huge before they made any music even. Like Atlantic Records signed them to a crazy recording deal before they'd really done anything because they were so esteemed as studio musicians. The fact that they sort of invent arena rock. I mean, that's debatable, but like I think that they were one of the inventors of arena rock. The fact that they were a band that a lot of people loved and a lot of people also kind of defined themselves as by not loving. The way the critical establishment, it was a real badge of honor among certain critics to hate Led Zeppelin. They were the first band that I think provoked that reaction in people. And also, yeah, I mean, just the fact that like we're kind of living with their influence today, and to the degree that it's like, I kind of think most trends in rock music since Led Zeppelin have been either bands trying to be Led Zeppelin or bands trying to be kind of the opposite of Led Zeppelin. So it's like, this sort of constant back and forth where it's like, after Zeppelin you get punk, which is in many senses a kind of response to the excess and bombast of Zeppelin and other bands of its type. Then you get '80s hard rock and heavy metal, which is much more return to Zeppelin. Then you get grunge, which is sort of a return to punk. And these two things are kind of just cyclical.
It's interesting because I recently read an article where someone said how most punk in the '70s was also put out by corporate influences and whatnot. But anyway, I wanted to thank you, Jack Hamilton, University of Virginia, for talking about Led Zeppelin, an important band in the evolution of rock music in the 20th century. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on.